everyone. It's an honor to be here again. And for some reason, we end up always recording a podcast on Valentine's Day. Today's a Saturday, and we're recording one. So, very happy to host one of my very good friends, Thandi, to this episode of Msingi Talks. Karibu sana, Thandi.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be back on the Msingi podcast.
Yes, you are actually one of the very first, I think so, the very first repeat guest. Welcome.
What an honor.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have you. So, what have you been up to since our last episode, which was, I think, around COVID?
Wow,
Yes.
that's a lot to catch up on.
Yes.
So at the time, I was working for the Warehouse,
Yes.
organization called the Warehouse in Cape Town. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. And I guess within that time, I finished my PhD.
Dr. Thandi Gamedze in the
Yeah.
house. Yes.
And then my time at the Warehouse ended in 2024, even though we are still, of course, collaborators in the work.
Yes.
But I started at the University of the Western Cape at the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice last year, January. So that's where I am now.
All right. Before we get to know what you're doing there, I always love knowing about my guests with two main questions. What brings you joy? Like what in life brings you joy? And it doesn't have to be like serious, deep things, but what is the one thing that when you think of, you're like, joy?
Good question. I mean, so many things. People. I have very good people in my life.
Yes.
You being one of them.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's such a joy to spend time with my people. Dancing. Love dancing.
Yeah.
Feel like that holds the key to so many of life's problems.
Yes.
And food.
Yeah, you're a fishmonger.
I am. I'm a fishfluencer.
Yes.
Actually, since the last podcast, I became a fishfluencer. Self-proclaimed. Others might not agree. But I have my few fans.
You started that fish thing in such a how did that start?
So there's this market in Cape Town, the Mowbray Market, which happens once a month, the first Saturday of every month. And it's basically like local farmers bring their goods and fisher people and other locally made products. So I think it was just I was there once with friends. Craig, who you know, and others from the Stewart family, and a few others I feel were there, and we went to the fish section. There's these wonderful local fisher people. Keisha is the main salesperson who convinces us to buy giant fish and do all kinds of things.
You get the hugest fish.
Yes.
What is the plural of fish? Fishes. Fish.
Fish. Yeah, fish.
Yes.
Fish. But anyway, this time. Oh, so first I bought bream, which was quite a small fish, and I cooked it as a whole fish, and I was so impressed with myself. The next month we went back to the market, and all they had was these huge yellow tails.
Yeah.
And so Keisha convinced Craig and I to buy one fish collectively.
Yeah.
And it was like it had the scales and all the guts and things. So it was quite a project.
Yeah.
So we agreed to take this on and then felt like we were unstoppable.
From the fishfluencers to the world, yeah. So this is what brings you joy. Then what brings you sorrow?
Well, I feel like honestly the current state of the world is very difficult to comprehend and figure out how to deal with.
Yeah.
So I feel like, I mean, really, I think it is that in my own context, in South Africa, specifically Cape Town, I think the huge amounts of inequality and continued injustice as kind of echoes from apartheid and the centuries of colonialism, which still are so present with us every day, and all the repercussions of that, the violence that continues to produce, the unlivable conditions for so many people. And then, I mean, I think that's a microcosm of what's happening globally. And I mean, over the past 2 years, the genocide in Gaza has been, such a situation of deep lament and pain, as well as what's going on in Sudan, and the horror and destruction and violence there. The US and what's been happening more recently. I mean, recently, but also, of course, over the many decades and centuries. But it just feels like a moment of, I think, consolidation of the evil powers and forces that are just, I don't know, getting emboldened and strengthened and causing just increasing amounts of destruction and harm.
Yeah.
So those are the things that keep me up at night and inspire, I think, the work that I do and, yeah, the continued work, I guess, to build an alternative world for all of us who are in it.
Yeah. And it takes quite a lot to especially intersect or interweave the joy and the sorrow, because the joy has to live with the sorrow and the sorrow has to live with the joy. Because I think what I've realized is that you need to find joy in the struggle. And most of us who are thinking and processing these things find it very hard to find joy.
Yeah.
And I think Bell Hooks talks about joy and the revolution. I think she does, and the role of joy
Yeah.
in on finding moments of joy
Yeah.
in that work.
I think it's so key because this work is also it's long term, like
Yeah.
it's a lifetime's work. And I mean, even at the end of a lifetime, there's no guarantee of the kind of world that we'll leave behind. So I think we have to be thinking about the long term and those practices that sustain us. And I think joy is so central to
Joy
that.
is important, man.
Yeah.
So you said the work that you're doing now, right? What is the work that you're doing now?
So, I mean, it feels so much like a continuation of the work I was doing before. So my work at the warehouse was, as you know, working with churches in their responses to different kinds of issues of social justice, towards a world that is a manifestation of God's peace and justice. And so it feels like I'm continuing that work from where I am, but just in a more academic space. So I'm now in a university, and I'm a researcher. Really, that's my role. I'm at a research center. So yeah, so I think that's still the kind of work that I do, even though it's more from a scholarly point of view sometimes. But I think what's really wonderful about the Desmond Tutu Center is that it has a really strong commitment to social justice that's outside of the academy as well as inside the academy. So it feels like it brings those worlds together. And I think coming from a very community-based organization that was thinking, I think, from the grassroots, from the positions of churches in South Africa, that's really, I think, formed me and formed my orientation even within the academic space. So So I think even though it looks sometimes like writing articles and publishing peer-reviewed articles or book chapters or whatever, it's also things like, so last year actually, and this was something that was really important to me and a really special moment. I organized, as part of the Desmond Tutu Center and my work there, organized the Kairos 40th anniversary gathering.
Yes.
So the Kairos document, which was produced in 1985 amidst deep crisis in apartheid South Africa, was a really key document, and I think still is a really key document. And it positioned itself as a challenge to the church, calling the church to be a more prophetic voice in this situation of injustice. And reading it today, honestly, it has so much relevance to where we are. Like it could be speaking to the church today. So I feel like this document was so life-changing for me. So it felt like last year being the 40th anniversary felt like a really important moment, I think, to revisit it and think about what it means for our work today. So we had a conference to think about that and brought together people from different geographical contexts, from different generations. So we had this kind of intergenerational conversation, people thinking about different kinds of social justice issues. And so it became like this dialogue between all of these different spaces, geographical, time, issues, and talked about kind of the relevance of this legacy and what it means for us to carry it into today. And that was really people from inside academia, as well as activists and community-based practitioners, church leaders. And so it felt like it brought together a lot of these worlds as well, which was really special. So yeah, so I think that's maybe a snapshot of some of what my work looks like.
So I think sometimes one of the questions that most of us would say is that what really is the role of scholarship in the pursuit of justice, like the role of academia, because sometimes you're like, we write articles and then they are in a book, so
Yeah.
what does it matter? So
Yeah.
what would you say is the role of scholarship and the academia in the pursuit of justice? Yeah.
Great question. And an important question that I think people who are in academic spaces need to, I think, constantly think about and revisit, because I think there is definitely a tendency for those spaces to swallow you up and for it to become like a bubble which actually no longer feels the need to speak to what's going on in the world, even though it might be writing about it, but that's not where it's rooted. So I think this is something that I constantly sit with, because I think that if scholarship doesn't speak to the real issues that are present in our context, then it's actually useless. I think the role. So it's, I think not everyone gets. It offers a space to really, I think, deeply reflect on what's happening in the world. Um, so the so you obviously are very familiar with the praxis cycle.
Yes.
And I think at its best, academia allows for a space for that. So the praxis cycle has these four kind of movements or moments. And the first is this thing of immersion, where you sit with and recognize the symptoms. What is happening in the world? What does it look like? What are the stories present? And really immerse yourself in those things. I think particular to whatever issue you're trying to think about. And then social analysis is the next piece. So to think about those symptoms or what things look like in light of these broader questions, like why is this happening? And so to think about it in the historical context, what about our histories has fed into these things and is continues to reproduce and reinvigorate these things? What are the power structures at play in reproducing these things? So really to grapple with the deeper questions. And I think the academic space and what scholarship should do is really to be bringing those broader contextual questions and realities to bear on what we're seeing and what's present with us, in order to, I think, provide a bigger picture of what these things that we're actually fighting are, so that we're not addressing the symptoms of the problem, but that we can actually address the roots, in such a way as it can provide, I think, a reality of flourishing systemically. So we're not just addressing something which has no relation to, I think, the real roots of the problem at hand. And then, I mean, in the praxis cycle, then there's also the moments of prophetic imagination. So a kind of imagination for a different world, which I think is also, and all of these things should be happening in conversation with
one another,
broader, communities. But there's also that piece. So what is the dream for a different kind of world? And I think in scholarship, like, people have been writing about these things for so long. Like, I think this is why I'm so passionate about, like, these historical moments and movements of social justice, because these people have been thinking about these things. And so it also allows us to, I think, build a tapestry, historically, from work that has been already done, of the kinds of worlds that these different movements dreamed of and were trying to work towards. And then hopefully part of our work is action towards that world, somehow. And I think for me, that's an important part of the scholarship as well, to make our work useful and accessible, whatever that looks like. So one thing that I really love that we did for the Kairos gathering was to I worked with Zach Stewart, a dear friend and artist, and we made the story of the Kairos document and kind of thinking about its key contributions into a zine. So I did the text and then Zach did the illustrations, as a kind of very easily accessible way to engage with the Kairos document and its history and some of the things that we need to take seriously. So what does it mean, I think, to make the work that you do at the university accessible and useful to the world?
And I think one of the reasons why it's important, you were saying that they need to be in conversation, is that I think of the action reflection arrow, though, where the actors and those who are doing the reflection, maybe the thinking, the policy making, and all of that, are always in conversation with the actors, the activists, the ones who are on the ground, so that action informs the reflection, the thinking, and the reflection informs the action.
Yes.
So it's always in conversation.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So one of the ways that you have done, or you're very passionate about, is, other than your friends,
yes, my secondary passion.
Yes. Your secondary passion is Black theology. What led you there? And what is Black theology? And does that mean there's white theology? And
Good questions.
Yes.
So Black theology is a kind of a theological tradition which I guess falls into the broader idea of theologies of liberation. And in South Africa, Black theology began like in the late 60s, early 70s, although you could, name Black theology named in that way. I think you could also trace roots back to different moments in time where the church in South Africa has embodied different kinds of prophetic theologies in the face of the repression that was going on. But as a named theological tradition, it started in the late 60s, early 70s. And essentially, it was a response of Black people to a situation in which they were being heavily repressed under the apartheid system. And it was not just political repression, but it was repression that was undergirded by theology. And so this apartheid and colonial theology, which had these racial hierarchies and these different kind of ideas that undergirded, I guess, this theology that repressed Black people and argued for separation of the races, but not only separation, obviously hierarchization. So I guess it comes out of Black people asking this question, how can I be Black and Christian? When this very Christianity is a huge part of what has led to my oppression as a Black person. And so it was this deep theological grappling with these questions in such a way as to create this theology that actually liberated Black people instead of furthered the oppression. And it was, I think, also importantly, as a theological tradition, it was deeply dialogical. So it was very much in conversation with, in the early years, Black theology in the United States. So there was a lot of co-mingling and conversation between like James Cone and Cornel West, Jacqueline Grant, all of these other people who were doing Black theology in the US context. And so there were deep similarities between the two and also deep differences because of the different contexts. And then over time, there was more conversation between Latin American liberation theology, womanist theology in the US as well, and other theologies of liberation. And I think for me, my interest in it and passion around it came from really grappling, being part of the church in South Africa today, but really grappling again with how can I be part of this, or what does it look like to be Christian when Christianity continues to oppress people on the margins, whether that's LGBTQI people or women still not allowed to be in leadership in certain churches, or perpetuating racial hierarchies in less overt ways than under apartheid. So grappling with those questions and then realizing that there was this whole theological tradition which overtly grappled with these questions in a situation of intense repression. And so there's such rich histories and legacies and wells to be drawn from, which I was never taught about in my experience in the church. But I think this stuff has so much to offer to us as we grapple with the role of faith in issues of social justice today.
And I think, so when we say, and I'm very like amazed about like the way you've contextualized it. So Black theology in a context of like, I am a Black Christian and Christianity is being used to oppress me. But what if these Black theologies, they're white theology? I ask that because why is there an importance to actually like stand out and call this Black theology? And then there's I think this whole week you've been at St. Paul's and hosted, I'm not sure if it hosted by PANAF, uh, St. Paul's, or by the Circle of Concerned Women Theologians, but there's also the conversation around the African women's experience of theology as well. Yeah.
Great questions. So the first one, is there a white theology? I think that's a really interesting question, and so much could be said about that, because I think so a lot of what theologies of liberation and contextual theologies have done is to insist that all theologies are contextual, actually. All theologies are coming from a certain place, have certain biases, are perpetuating certain norms, have an agenda, and I think that really pushed back against this idea that theology is universal. Theology just comes down to us, pre-packaged from heaven, as it is, in the correct way. And so I think what has just been called theology is white theology, because it's theology that has come from Western countries. Generally, it's been done by white men. People of color and women and people in the global South have historically been excluded from the spaces of doing theology, at least for these people who are considered to be these classic theologians who get taught in most institutions around the world, not only in the West. So I think in different movements, I think people have also been clear to name that as white theology. So to give it a context, actually, and refuse that it's just come out of nowhere and been given to us. So yeah, I think that's really important, because still often there's these other theologies, Black theology, womanist theology, queer theology, have these adjectives, is that the word?
Yes, they have
attached.
they have something like to
Yes.
in front of it.
Yeah, so you can't just call it theology, you must call it Black theology. But I think it is important to name, and I think wherever our theology comes from, that lens and that bias and that context must be named for us to do theology authentically. And then you spoke about, so I was at St. Paul's this week, which was really wonderful, and the day we spent at the university, there was a chapel service and then a public lecture, and some of the real OGs of the circle were there.
My favorite,
which was incredibly special.
Yes.
And so and the group that was there are like younger Anglican or Anglican adjacent women leaders and theologians. And the mentors of that group were these also real OGs in different contextual theologies. So Puilan Kwok, originally from Hong Kong, who's been doing this kind of theology from that perspective for a really long time as a woman. And I think for many years, she was in many of the spaces that she was in, she was the only Asian woman theologian. And so really paved the way and pioneered in many ways in that area in post-colonial Anglicanism and theology. And then Jenny Tepa, who's a Maori theologian, doing really important work in New Zealand and thinking about Indigenous theology and thought. And then Esther Mombo, who's been doing amazing work in African womanist theology for a long time. And also paving the way, I think, for us to walk in this amazing path that has been paved in very difficult situations. I mean, the barriers that all of them, I think, have faced are huge. Making space for women in these very patriarchal spaces. So I think that lens is really important, because it shows that these spaces of liberation, supposedly, like Black theology, like other forms of liberation theology, have to contend with the oppression which is present within them. And so often they've been very patriarchal spaces in various ways. I think women have been excluded from many decision-making structures, excluded from theological education spaces, excluded in various ways. And so I think what African womanist theology offers is a lens to really think about intersectionality, to think about how spaces of liberation can also be spaces of oppression, and how we expand the liberation. I think that should always be our lens. Who are we missing here? Is anyone being oppressed by our efforts for liberation, or is there anyone we're forgetting? Who is being silenced? Who isn't here? And I think that's a lens that we have to hold constantly.
Yeah. And that's very hard, because most of the times, as people who are in the liberation, justice seeking movements, it's very difficult for us to see ourselves as oppressors. And sometimes we are, without knowing, perpetuating some form of oppression within our spaces in the quest of liberation. I wanted to maybe explain a bit about like whiteness and as an ideology, and not generally to mean white people, because that sometimes becomes a contestation. And wanted to share that white theology, whiteness is about of course it's based from the Anglo-European perspective, but it's a social, structural, and historical construct that esteems, and a friend of mine called Curtis Reed helped me understand what whiteness as an ideology is, and talked about what is seen as right, what is seen as it's the objectivity rather than subjectivity. So there's always one way of doing things, and then there's the linear thinking, then there's I think what facts become king more than what people are going through, the emotions around it. But the one that really holds to me is the issue of objective truth, where that the one way of doing things is the only way. And so I would urge people who are listening to us to think through, or to explore what whiteness is as a concept, and see even how some of us are steeped in it, because it has been the way of the world. Yeah. And even gender, you look at the objective male as the ideal versus the emotional female, and other genders as something else. You talked about Black theology, and I know there's your hero, someone who you love and have, and there's a video of you crying.
Oh my goodness.
This is the disadvantage of hosting a podcast with a friend.
True. She knows all my secrets.
Yes. You engaged a lot with the works of Professor Mosala. What, in a minute or two?
Wow, that's hard.
Because this took a whole dissertation. Why was Professor Mosala's work so important to you as you were having conversations around Black theology? And introduce us to Prof Mosala. Yes.
I would love to.
Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely a hero of mine, and someone who I think has done such important work. So he's a biblical scholar, and his work is really thinking about biblical hermeneutics, so how we read the Bible. And I think his intervention was really important in South African Black theology because in the broader Black theology and liberation theology movements, the church and theology were recognized as sites of struggle. So that these things are not universal or singular, but there's always a power struggle for definition, for meaning.
Maybe before that, what is a site of struggle?
So a site of struggle really, I mean, people use it differently, but it really, I guess, talks about something being a thing of a contested thing. So the church, so in the Kairos document, it talks about the church as a site of struggle. And so it's basically saying that the church at the time in South Africa was not a homogenous organization saying one thing and preaching one theology, but there were actually many churches in a way at play, preaching very different theologies and standing for very different things. So it talks about the church which preaches the theology of apartheid, basically, which was the Dutch Reformed Church at the time. Then it talks about the church that preaches almost this theology of apoliticality and neutrality, so-called neutrality, which in essence wants an end to apartheid and peace and reconciliation, but doesn't recognize the roots of the problem, what the structures are that are actually causing this thing and reproducing this thing. And so it wants to just plaster over it with these nice ideas like peace and reconciliation. Just get along better and we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And then it talked about the prophetic church of the time, which actually does deep social analysis and challenges the roots of the issue theologically towards a world which embodies more justice. So that's kind of this idea of a site of struggle. It's this contested space, and so many theologians were saying that the church and theology are sites of struggle, but the Bible is almost untouchable. So the Bible, if read correctly, will always be a text of liberation. But Itumeleng Mosala said that no, the Bible itself is also a site of struggle. It's also a contested text. So within its very pages are narratives and ideologies of liberation, but also narratives of oppression and subjugation. And those are present, those are visible and overt, as well as more covert and present in the silences or the people who are excluded from the text. And so in order for the Bible to become a site of liberation, we actually have to recognize the struggles that are going on within its pages, so that we can read that in conversation with the struggles that we're dealing with today. So that's some of his work. And I think this thing, fundamentally, it's about having a lens of struggle. So reading everything, whether it's the biblical text or the world, the way we see it, through the lens of struggle, and recognizing that there's not this singular story. In every liberation movement, there's not a singular story of liberation. And so reading it through the lens of struggle, I think allows us to see, that Black theology actually was also oppressing and marginalizing women. So we don't read it as a movement of singular liberation, but it allows us to see the nuance so that we don't reproduce those injustices, I think.
Um, is there like a quote from Prof Mosala that you would like to lift up, or something, a statement from him that,
You know, I have a poem that I
yeah?
wrote about him.
Is this the one? And this is the one you read and cried?
This is the one I read and cried. Let me see if I can find it. But this was, yeah, so I was reading, thinking about, I think, the contributions of Black theology to my own thinking. And it's kind of when I wrote it, I imagined it as a part of a series, but it's still the only one that I've written so far. So
Okay.
it's a very small series. But this doesn't really have a title. Well, at the moment it's called Lessons from Mosala.
Okay.
So these are some of the lessons that I have learned from his work and from him. From Mosala, I have learned to view it all through the lens of struggle. Learned that face value is never the whole picture, but the result of a collision of powers, some emerging as victors while others' stories remain untold. From Mosala, I have learned to take the silences seriously, to train my eyes to see the gaps as clearly as the text, to tease out that which is unsaid and what it is shouting, and to recreate worlds from the fragments. From Mosala, I have learned to see the struggles of the oppressed as sacred texts, that all other texts should be read from. I have learned that the struggle for justice and liberation is the fire that makes a thing sacred, the fire from which divinity is born. From Mosala, I have learned that it is not enough to interrogate our own hermeneutics, but that every point of both production and interpretation must be interrogated. I have learned that nothing must escape the hermeneutic of suspicion, for it is struggle all the way down.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you have such a gift with words as well. And you are on, I don't know if it's your 9 to 5 or the other side, you are an artist, a poet. And I was wondering about the role of art as well in justice work. What would you say that helps with?
Yeah, I think there's a huge, I think the role of art is really important. And I think allows seeing. A lot of the times, I think artists can have a gift of saying things the way they are, and painting pictures that are maybe pictures that people don't want to see. And I think it's really the prophetic gift. I think many artists bring the prophetic gift, and that's not to say that art can't also be used in service of the empire. So I think art itself is a site of struggle. But I think often the artists in social movements and in society are the seers who are, I think, attentive to the powers and to what's going on. And through their art, I think many times they allow others to see that too. And then I think the same way as Brueggemann's idea of the prophetic imagination, which is not only calling out the powers that perpetuate injustice, but it's also pointing to an alternative world. And so I think the arts also do that in really beautiful and powerful ways.
And you write beautiful pieces, Thandi. I think
Thank
I still can hear your voice in the Justice. Do you remember the Justice Conference one, the Amos one?
Yes.
Which is so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
That's so amazing. Thank you for
you.
gifting us in
Such
that
a
way.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We talked a bit in the beginning about intersectionality, and this is how I'd like to wrap up our conversation. Um, Beautifully expressed what the works and the words of Mosala have done for you. But there is the place of, and you had said about silos, where the academias and the activists are consistently in silos. Yeah. Why is intersectionality important? And maybe you can give a brief uh, introduction to intersectionality, and also, of course, we honor the Black American women. Was it Kimberly?
Kimberly
Crenshaw,
Crenshaw,
yes,
yeah.
Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with that term and the word. Why is intersectionality important?
Yeah, so what she did um, in in kind of conceptualizing this thing, and of course it had been written about, you know, in different ways before and recognized in different ways before, but I think she named this thing and really dug deep into what it looked like in the U.S. context, particularly thinking of Black women and the kind of triple oppression, basically of being oppressed in terms of your race as a Black person, being oppressed in terms of your gender as a woman, and then often because often race and class are so intertwined and tied together, often Black women would also be oppressed at a class level. Um, and so she highlighted the importance of thinking about these things together, um, because many, and recognized that the problem of many movements being singularly focused on one thing. So whether that was white feminism, obviously they didn't term it white feminism, but a lot of these feminist movements, and she's responding to the movements in the United States, but were very blind to women of color and the additional burdens that women of color faced in these spaces. And so their idea of liberation really didn't include liberation of women of color. And so in that space, this idea of intersectionality forces a reckoning with race and class together. And then race and gender together and class. And then she talks about similarly in like the civil rights movement, the focus being on race, then ignored the specific oppressions of Black women. And so that that's the context, but it invites, I think, a broader analysis of power, and the way that power operates in very nuanced and complex ways, to oppress certain people and marginalize certain people while privileging others, in very complex ways. And so intersectionality invites, I think, continued reflexivity on power. So it's a constant invitation, I think, to think about what power you hold in the space, where you might be marginalized and for what reasons, where you might be privileged and for what reasons. And so I think having that lens allows us to build movements and theologies that are much more liberative for everyone. And I think what's important is that we have to recognize that we all have blind spots. And so I think the first step is to have a lens of intersectionality and to recognize that there are these intersecting powers at play, but also to recognize that because of our own positioning, we might not see what all of those are. And so to be continually open to listening to those who bear the brunt of these structures of power and structures of domination that we live in, and to be attentive to the things that we don't yet know.
Yeah.
Because this work of liberation is a lifetime's work, and we're constantly learning and growing and figuring out how to move in ways that are liberative to all.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways where I learned a lot more about intersectionality was in the Kenyan social justice movement. And a term that keeps coming up is that we need to connect struggles. Yeah, the connection of struggle, that your struggle and my struggle are somehow connected. That a struggle for, against extrajudicial execution is a struggle that connects to lack of water, it connects to, and so all these struggles, when you see people agitating for the right to maybe water, is that you have to somehow know that that's connected to your current struggle, which I find to be very important.
Yeah, totally.
We've talked a lot about theology, and as I was reflecting, I was wondering, for someone who does not understand this theology business, why is it important? Like, and like in is very like the opposite of how we should do conversations. But why is theology important in all of these conversations? And what is theology in, and why does it matter? Yeah.
Big questions. And you know, the real theologians, the theologians that have really studied theology would not consider me a theologian.
Why?
Because I actually don't have formal theological training.
Yeah.
Which I think is a, I mean, maybe is a good entry point also to this question, because I think many people who would see themselves as people who think about theology of liberation or think about justice, I definitely believe that we all do theology.
Yeah.
And all of us, because of that, are theologians. And theology, I guess, in essence, is just, I think, reflection on God and God in the world and with creation and with each other. I think anything that kind of touches on that is really theology. And why it's important, I think, I mean, particularly in contexts like ours, where religion is very prevalent and strong, and Christianity is very prevalent and strong. In South Africa, I think over 80% of the population identifies as Christian, and attends church regularly and all of these things. So the way that we think about God, I think, determines a lot of the way that we act in the world, the way that we see each other, the way that we see land, creation, the way that we see issues of justice. And so if our theology is purely thinking about the afterlife, then that has impacts for how we show up and are present in this current world, and what we think of issues of social justice in this current world. And so I think our theologies are deeply powerful in determining how we live and what our priorities are. And this is why I think they need to be engaged. And particularly when theology is so overt in upholding structures of domination. So an example would be apartheid, very overtly theological in its orientation and its foundations. I mean, there's many examples. I think that's a very overt example. I think another overt example is Christian Zionism and the way it upholds the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and currently has been used to justify genocide in Palestine, because of this idea that Jesus will only return when all the Jews are back in the Holy Land, what's seen as the Holy Land. And of course, a conflation of the Israel that we read about in the Bible with the state of Israel, an idea that these two are the same things, as well as various kinds of theological orientations that uphold this. And as we see so acutely in the past 2 years, these theologies allow for absolutely inhumane things to happen and continue. So Mitri Rahib, who's a Palestinian theologian, one of the most prominent, talks about this idea, so Christian Zionism being the software that upholds the hardware of the Israeli occupation. And he says that if Christians rejected Zionism, this thing would actually not continue, because Christian Zionism is actually the strongest support of the occupation, and most prominently in the US, where it holds a lot of power, but also increasingly, but also increasingly on the African continent and in various global South contexts. So I think, particularly in these situations where theology is so overtly being used to uphold oppression, it's so important to combat this theologically, so that we can undo some of the harm that our theologies have been doing.
Yeah, and the for me, in terms of understanding that theology is not innocent in a sense. And also, when you talk about Christian Zionism as a theology, is to know that the irony of Christian Zionism is that it was invented by an atheist. I find that to be like, I find that to be so hilarious. Yeah, but because they have been able to see it as a tool that can be used to, continually like expand the domination of the apartheid that's happening right now. Yeah, so
Yeah.
what a way to end this conversation.
What a
But
way indeed.
is there anything that you, from this conversation, that you would like to highlight? Is there something that you wanted to speak about that we have not spoken about yet?
No, I think maybe just to, I think, go back to what you said about the importance of connecting struggles.
Yeah.
And reading about Black theology and immersing myself in that space also, I think, has shown the different solidarity networks that were operational at the time. Whether it's there's something called Eat What, the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, which was this incredible network that
Sounds cool.
met together across the global South and really developed these anti-imperial theologies in conversation with other contexts. And these different networks. And I think, going back to what we were saying in the beginning, with this moment being one of consolidation of these different kinds of powers that seek to oppress various groups of people, I think the invitation is for us to also be consolidating and to be connecting across struggles and to be trying to find each other and trying to think about what moving collectively towards this alternate world looks like, because I don't think we can do it without that. Actually, none of us, or no group, I think, has the tools or capacity or ability to defeat this monster alone. And so I think it's all the more urgent in this time to be connecting and collaborating.
Yay. Thank you. And you do such great work of connecting and collaborating. Thank you for
As
the
do
work
you.
that you do.
Thank
you for the art. Thank you for the joy, the sorrow, all of that. Thank you for being you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's a pleasure.
You're humbled.
Thank you for being you and for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this our third episode of the year of Msingi Talks. I hope that what we're talking about, I hope that inspires you to keep doing justice and to keep loving your neighbor, to keep loving God, and to being salt and light in the world. Till next time, keep doing justice.